For TigerDetails.com, Jerit Roser here with Tony Tsoukalas from Bama Insider, the Alabama site on the Rivals Network, getting ready for another year of LSU and Alabama, but one that we were just talking about is kind of a different feel, certainly, than last year and some recent years. Tony, appreciate you taking some time leading up to this one to chat about it all. How are things going out y'all's way?
Yeah, good. It is kind of an expected game here on the schedule after things got shuffled around, but I think one that at least a lot of Alabama fans are looking forward to.
Yeah, I mentioned it definitely has a different feel. I know when the game had to be removed from the schedule a couple weeks ago, as much as the LSU coaches and players talked about they really wanted to play Alabama and were looking forward to the opportunity, hoping they'd get to reschedule it. I don't think the fan base largely felt the same way. I think with the way things had gone, they felt comfortable with maybe not playing Alabama this year. But here we are 2 weeks later, games on the schedule. The Tigers, for their team perspective, are still talking about the excitement of playing Alabama year in and year out, regardless of what any records are. What's kind of the feel from the Crimson Tide side of this thing? Because it's a lot easier probably to get hype when you lost the one last year.
Yeah, and Alabama's being kind of guarded against that. You're getting your same processed answers of, LSU's the next opponent. That kind of coach speak from the players because it's been like entrenched in their minds, not to say anything for motivation. But I think you can tell that these players definitely want to make a statement in this game. They felt disrespected. Not so much by the game itself last year, but maybe some of the antics after the game. Look, this is an Alabama team that, Bo Nix, the Auburn quarterback, slightly called Mac Jones a game manager, and they took that to heart. So if you look at what LSU did after the game last year, I mean, if they're going to take the Bo Nix statement to heart, they're definitely going to take this to heart. I'm not sure how, after this game got canceled, I couldn't tell you how Alabama players kind of reacted in terms of do they really want to play it? But now that they have to play it, I definitely think that they want to make a statement and kind of amend for last year's game. And it'd be kind of like a little bit of a revenge tour from Alabama because they're playing Auburn and LSU in back-to-back weeks.
Yeah, I talked to, I don't remember which of our peers at other sites I talked to recently that I said basically – whatever struggles LSU's having this year after everyone watched them touchdown dance all over national television all last year, no one's really feeling bad and everyone's kind of cherishing the opportunity. And I'm sure that is as true in Tuscaloosa as anywhere after. I mean, as you mentioned, there was almost a decade of frustration let loose from the LSU team after finally getting on the right side of things a year ago.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it might be more from the fans' perspective. I mean, I don't know. We tried to give the fans what they want on our YouTube channel, and man, we've been playing that halftime speech or the midfield speech by Ed Orgeron. This is our house now, and they've been eating that up from the Alabama fans. So I think the real rivalry in this game heading into it is Alabama fans versus Ed Orgeron. That's the real conflict right now. I'm not sure how much the players, and I'm not sure how much the whole team is really mad at LSU, but definitely the Alabama fan base is wants to see Ed Orgeron fall on his face.
Coming into this year off of last year's performance and having the type of year that Alabama's having right now, what has stood out to you for the Crimson Tide to be back at this point where they're number one in the nation, and how much excitement is there for that fan base too, considering that this is a team that wants to compete for a national championship every year, fell short last year, and now they're looking as much of a favorite as there is in the country again.
Yeah, I think what really stood out to me is how they've handled this whole pandemic. I think, Alabama's pretty much handled it as well as any other team. And look, they didn't have a lot of people opt out. If you look at the difference between Alabama and LSU right now, a lot of it comes down to the commitment for this season. And look, I get it from an LSU standpoint as well. And their players that decided to opt out, that's their own decisions. But Alabama was fortunate enough to have most of its stars return that weren't going to the draft. And then they've been locked in. They've handled everything pretty well. And I think that it's just they've really been driven to make up for last season. I think that's been a huge motivator. And if you look at the play on the field, I kind of already expected this Alabama offense to be just as good as it was last year. I'm really high on Mac Jones. I said at the beginning of the season, I thought he was going to be the best quarterback in the SEC. Debatable between whether that's him or Trask, but I was pretty much on the money right there. And then the defense, I think it's been coming around. I think it was a little bit susceptible to things early in the season. The secondary was still very new. I think you're starting to see guys like Malachi Moore, freshman, Brian Branch, freshman. Those guys are stepping up in the secondary, and I think it's starting to become a better secondary. I don't think there really is any great defenses in the SEC right now. But I think, Alabama's right up there with one of the best of them. And so I think that the culmination of all that's kind of what you expect to see in a number one team.
You mentioned the quote from Bo Nix previously about Mac Jones as a game manager. I feel like every Wednesday now I've heard for recent weeks, I've heard Coach Orgeron asked about Mac Jones' comparisons to Joe Burrow in terms of the huge step forward and the type of season he's having. What has really impressed you about Mac this year that has put him in that sort of a conversation where he's being compared to a guy that set all kinds of records last year, and he's in that conversation for a Heisman and the top passer in the SEC and all of those things?
So I wrote a story on Mac at the beginning. Like I said, I kind of saw this coming a little bit, maybe not to this extent, but I saw him having a big year. And in the offseason, I talked with one of his friends that he was training with, and he said that this is interesting because he looked at a lot of Joe Burrow's tape, and the thing that he really wanted to get from Joe Burrow is the drive in his legs, and not only just the ability to break through arm tackles in the pocket, kind of like what Joe Burrow could do, but also generate that power in his deep throws. I think that's something that you've really seen with Mac this year. He's been delivering the deep ball really well. Obviously, that's something we saw with Joe as well. So if you're going to do, similarities between the two, that's one of them. I think, their ability to kind of extend plays in the pocket and then hit those big receivers that they had. I think that they're comparable at that level. And look, Joe Burrow had a great year. I'm not quite sure Mac's at that, that level this year. I mean, he's pretty close, but it's hard to match those stats of Joe Burrow. But like I said, the deep ball, his consistency, and then also his ability to kind of come back from adversity. If you see Mac make a mistake, and they've been rare this season, but he's been able to bounce back and really, go on long runs of accuracy and really be able to bounce back from mistakes.
Talking about some of those weapons, Devonta Smith is a guy that certainly Louisiana fans know from his high school career to meet and then being a big player in this matchup in recent years. And I think folks nationally now know Tay pretty well. How impressed have you been with him? He's having a fantastic season yet again, but just his progression through his years out there in Tuscaloosa to go from where he arrived to now being considered one of the top wide receivers in the country. And as much as folks in Louisiana are looking forward to Jamar Chase potentially being a first receiver drafted this year, I think Tay is very much in that same conversation.
I definitely think so. He's right up in that level. Look, the thing when I look at Devonta Smith is if you go back and from an Alabama perspective, you go back and look at clips of Amari Cooper. He was obviously the number one receiving weapon on that, the 2015 team, 2014 team. 2014 team. And you'd look and he'd be wide open, and you'd be like, why is this guy wide open? And you'd think that, defenses would be able to lock him down, but they weren't. And I think when you look at Devonta Smith, same thing. I mean, like you saw him against Auburn, and he somehow found a way to get wide open. Alabama's been really good at disguising him in things. His second touchdown against Auburn, he was disguised as a blocker and then caught a quick slant. It was the most unfair play. Because I don't know how you defend it. He's such a smooth route runner. He's a wiry guy, but he can block, which is crazy because he has no meat on his bones. Mm-hmm. And then, obviously you've seen his hands. I mean, the guy, if you throw it up, he'll come up with a catch. So he's a really complete receiver. When you look at him, he doesn't necessarily look like the scariest dude, but he's really deceiving. And I think he's going to be really successful in the league in the next few years.
There's been a lot of talk out this way of getting a chance to see the Devonta Smith and Derek Stingley Jr. matchup again, and that game in Tuscaloosa last year. As much as LSU fans left ecstatic about it, I think that's one that has really kind of stuck with Stingley in terms of feeling like he didn't have his best showing, and that he's kind of had this circled on his calendar a little bit. What's kind of your outlook there and your thoughts heading into a matchup that is, again, one of the best receivers in the country, one of the best corners in the country, and regardless of how it shakes out, should be a lot of fun for football fans?
Yeah, I mentioned that in my article today on the site. Look, Derek Stingley was, arguably the best cornerback in college football last year, but that game against Alabama was a big blemish. He was matched up against Devonta Smith 6 times in that game. He allowed 5 receptions for 211 yards and 2 touchdowns. All 5 of the receptions went for first downs for Devonta. I mean, those are not the numbers you're expecting to see with a receiver going up against a guy like Derek Stingley. So I think this is a big statement game for him in terms of showing that he can kind of amend for that, and then it's another game to showcase his talents against an NFL receiver, because in a year's time, he's going to be a first round prospect himself. So look, there might not be a lot to play for, this season for LSU, but for a guy like Stingley, I think this is a huge game for him to kind of to showcase that. And LSU secondary too. I mean, this is the school that prides itself on being a DBU, and the secondary has just fallen apart this year. Second worst in the SEC. So I think this is if you can make a statement against a really good Alabama passing attack, it could provide some momentum, if not for the rest of this year, maybe into next year.
And the Tigers feel like they may have, and certainly hope that they have, turned a little bit of a corner defensively this past week against Texas A&M. And I mean, from my perspective, they looked as good as they have, which isn't necessarily saying a ton, but they did have some success on the defensive side of the ball in College Station. As you look to this matchup and try to forecast some different areas that stand out to you, or how you see things playing out on Saturday, what, if any, areas do you see from LSU that give you any sort of cause for concern for Alabama? What are some areas, if any, that you think, that's a spot where the Tigers could have some success, or that's a spot that the Crimson Tide maybe could be a little bit more vulnerable than others, that if there was going to be a huge upset this weekend, would be some places where we'd be starting?
Yeah, so it all starts with Eric Gilbert. Alabama struggled against tight ends before. He's obviously now the biggest weapon for LSU, so I think the game plan starts and ends with him, getting him the ball as many different ways as you can. If you can involve him in some pre-snap, motions, or try to get some creative packages to get him the ball, I think that you can really exploit Alabama's defense to a certain extent. Now I'm sure that, the loss of Terrace Marshall kind of allows Alabama to game plan more directly against Eric Gilbert. But that's something that, we've seen Alabama struggle with in the past, and it's a strength of LSU. So I circle it starting there. But really just pre-snap motions and movements and shifts, those have thrown off Alabama in the past. They're getting better about those, but that's kind of what I would do if I was LSU, just because that's been the recipe for success. Now, Alabama's, defense has been getting better in every single week, which is encouraging for the Tide. But I still think that, there's still some young players, and maybe you can catch them off guard early in the game. And the other thing, too, is just, LSU is going to have to capitalize on those things. If they get a big play against Alabama, they're going to have to score on it, not just a field goal, but a touchdown. The last 2 weeks, you've seen Kentucky and Auburn, even when they are able to move the ball, they have to settle for field goals. And that's just not going to get it done against this Alabama going against this Alabama offense that's going to score touchdowns more often than not.
On the defensive side, I know the coaches and players try to downplay the weirdness of this year as much as possible and try to not give excuses. But as you look at an Alabama team that hasn't had the type of year on defense that you're used to seeing in Tuscaloosa, and you mentioned it's been the same sort of thing in Baton Rouge, where there's a lot of pride in calling themselves DBU, and they've just been torched by opposing offenses most of this year. what do you kind of attribute some of that to? Do you think that as much as people downplay it, that the unusual offseason and unusual season is a pretty big culprit there, or are there other factors for Alabama that you kind of point to over that?
I think it was at first, and I think if you look at some of those big games, I know LSU was 500 yards against what now looks like a pretty pedestrian Mississippi State offense. I think you can start blaming that on rustiness or the offseason being so difficult. But now we're 10 games in. I think the majority of and like I said, nobody really has a great defense in the SEC. When you're looking at those, I think it's really just the offenses have gotten better. And that's the kind of the same in college football in general. Offenses are now beating defenses. Offense is the way that you win championships now in college football. But look at the SEC quarterbacks that you have. You have Matt Corral, you have Mac Jones, you have Kyle Trask. I mean, those are three of the best passers in the nation. The SEC used to have these quarterbacks where, for a while, recently they've had good quarterbacks, but in the past when these defenses were, the best in the country, the quarterback play wasn't there. You're starting to see more and more playmakers and more spread offense, more high fast-paced offenses in the SEC, and I think that's just kind of changing. I don't think you're going to see – I think it's more of an evolution of the game per se than it is to do anything with the pandemic.
And I saw you had up this morning a piece that kind of led off with Chris Allen, another Louisiana guy, a local guy here in Baton Rouge from Southern Lab, and looking at is he ready to kind of explode and take a whole nother step forward and be that much of a playmaker for the defense. Take me through some of what you've seen from Chris and what the outlook is for him the rest of the year and how big he can be for that Tide defense.
Nobody talks about it, but Chris Allen is slowly becoming a playmaker for Alabama's defense. I mean, look, he's leading the team in tackles for loss and in sacks. And he had probably his best game against Auburn. Look, he's never put it together quite like Alabama was hoping he would. He came in and was instantly one of the hottest defensive outside linebacking prospects that Alabama had. And then he had that injury. It kind of set him back. He kind of got lost in the mix. And now we're starting to see him in his redshirt junior year, kind of turn into more of that starting, or, maybe he doesn't always start, but like that Sam linebacker that's going to come in and really make some plays. He's a guy that can get after the quarterback. I think earlier in the season, he was just missing. He wasn't quite getting there fast enough, and I think he's gotten a little bit better. Nick Saban calls it pulling the pin, and really it's just a matter of him, he knows what he needs to do. He just needs to do it and have confidence in his ability to do it, and I think now you're starting to see that. Maybe some of that hesitation from him is gone. So if he can play without that hesitation, I'm sure people in Baton Rouge watching him in high school know that the kind of defensive playmaker he can be. So that could be big for Alabama's defense if they're able to, kind of ramp up that pass rush.
What are some other things you guys have coming this week, I guess, for folks out here on the LSU side that are just looking to soak up as much information on Alabama, which is probably not a lot of LSU fans that are, but
yeah.
if they want to know what's coming to town, what are some other pieces you guys have coming the rest of the week?
Yeah, well, definitely, Nick Saban speaks on the SEC teleconference, just in a couple hours. And then as well as he's going to speak tonight. So we'll have all the information from that. Just your general game coverage, and also if you really want to see it as an LSU fan, maybe get upset a little bit at some talk of Alabama. We have a really good YouTube channel to check out as well at Bama Insider. So maybe spy on the enemy and check out some of our content.
There you go, Tony. Appreciate you, man.
Yeah. Sure.
Again, he's Tony Tsoukalas from Bama Insider for TigerDetails.com. Jerit Roser. Thanks.